Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Church Night. This is a very different way of doing Church Night than we're used to, since we're under our stay-at-home order from our governor. We are not gathering at church these days, but rather we are doing things from home. And so I am sitting here at home and I'm going to have some suggestions for you for church night tonight. There's a marvelous resource called Church Next that has brief courses on various topics. The topic that I've chosen for tonight is called Everyday Spiritual Practices. And I chose everyday spiritual practices because our spiritual practices have changed quite significantly in these last few weeks. We are not able to gather together at our beautiful St. Paul's Church and be together for our worship and for meals and fellowship and Christian formation and all the things that we do. But this Church Next course that I'm suggesting that you take tonight or whenever you are able is a wonderful way to remind ourselves that we can engage in spiritual practices wherever we are, and especially engage in spiritual practices in our home. So this course suggests that we are able to view everyday kinds of things like washing dishes and changing diapers as spiritual practices. These everyday things that we do, when done mindfully, done intentionally, can become spiritual practices. Barbara Brown Taylor wrote a marvelous book. It's entitled An Altar in the World, and she suggests the same thing, that our spiritual practices aren't just what we do when we gather together in church or more formal kinds of prayer and worship, but that the everyday things of our lives can also be spiritual practices. Spiritual practices help us to return to God, to be mindful of God's presence within us, within the people around us, and in our world. That is really the heart and soul of what spiritual practices do. They help us to be mindful, to be present in the moment. How often does it happen? How often that we are distracted? We're either worried about what's to come, or we live with regret about the past. We're not present in the moment and mindful of what's happening right here and right now. And maybe the way that things have changed for us in light of this staying at home, maybe that can help us to be more present and more mindful. Our patterns have changed. We're no longer rushing out in the evening to do events. We're no longer going to restaurants and doing those kinds of things. So as our patterns change, perhaps it can help us to be more mindful of how we are living right here and right now. Maybe the time that we can take for things can be different now. Maybe we're not so rushed. Maybe we eat more mindfully, or maybe we have interactions with our loved ones a little more mindfully. Pick up the phone and call and really be attentive to the person that you're talking to. These are spiritual practices that lead us, I think, toward being grateful. I have said this before, I'll say it again. I think gratitude is the heart and soul of the spiritual life. Being thankful for who we are, being thankful for being in relationship with God and each other, being thankful for the everyday blessings that it's so easy to take for granted. Maybe this time, this kind of different time that we're in, will make us more present and mindful and lead us more toward gratitude. I encourage you to think about where you might create a space in your home to engage in your spiritual practice, whether that might be journaling or spiritual reading or meditation, reading the Bible. Create a space that works for you. Create a space where you might have pictures or icons that are inspiring for you. You might have candles in that space. Candles are a nice way of making a spiritual space. And music can be a part of that as well, playing just instrumental music or some kind of spiritual music. That's also a nice way to create this space. So think about that, where you might create a space that's all your own, somewhere in your home, a spiritual place, where you can take the time. That's the other part of spiritual practice, is to take the time, to make it a habit, to set time aside each day, perhaps the same time if you're a morning person, to set that time aside first thing in the morning. If you're a night person, maybe it's that night time of looking back over the day. Whenever it is, set that time aside and make it a habit. If you're going to get good at something, you have to practice it, right? Professional golfers are good because they swing that club thousands of times and develop that muscle memory that makes them good at that sport. The same thing is true in terms of our spiritual lives and spiritual practices. The more that we practice, the more that we develop spiritual muscle, and the more that we become good at the habits, the spiritual habits that we put in place in our lives. So, everyday spiritual practices. I encourage you to take this Church Next course. The link is available. You can find that link. There are about 4 brief videos, 4 to 5 minute videos. They're really good. And then there are discussion questions that follow. You can reflect on those discussion questions. You can see how others have reflected on those discussion questions. So make your way through this course, Everyday Spiritual Practices. View the videos, take some time to reflect on them, and then look at the discussion questions and enjoy this very different way of doing church night, but enjoy digging in a little bit to spiritual practices and keep at it. Practice, practice, practice. God's blessings to you and yours.